Okay. So hello, everybody. Today is a great pleasure to host one more FSR talk, which is part of our online event series at the Florence School of Regulation. So the FSR talk is a monthly online event focused on inviting speakers who could address topics on energy and climate regulation. They're of interest to our global audience, not only our traditional audience, which is most focused on EU, but also those who are interested on discussing regulation issues that also it's expanding towards Africa, Asia, and South Americans and North America. Therefore, I could not be in better company for hosting these events. As usual, here we have Carol Auer, representing the African School of Regulation. Usually the co-host of also this event is Shweta, representing the FSR Global India. And today, specifically, what do you have as an episode of today? We have a very special speaker discussing a breakthrough work. So many projects of renewable and low carbon hydrogen are currently in the designing of pre-FID stage. The issue of the hydrogen off-takers has proven to be a critical concern. And specifically here, I'm speaking about the sales and purchase agreements and derivatives that has moved into this spotlight. The IEAN, for those who doesn't know, Association of International Energy Negotiators, our very well reputed association, known for its track record of developing a model of agreements, specifically for oil and gas sector. Many of you has been working directly or indirectly for joint venture agreements that they have been designed. Initiated this very important initiative, which is to draft standard contracts for hydrogen through this hydrogen task force. And today we have like the best person to be speaking about the development of this work. And here I'm speaking specifically about the lead of this task force, which is Dr. Nuno Antunes, which are very grateful to have it today. So Nuno is graduating the law from the Faculty of Law of the University of Lisbon and has his master and PhD from the University of Durham. So besides being his academic career, which is definitely brilliant, he's also partner of Miranda Associados, is an invited professor from Catholic University of Portugal, and has been before the legal advisor of the Prime Minister of Timor-Leste for matters of energy. And to comment and as an invited discussant, is usually what we have, we always invited a discussant to join us and raise questions and to dive into the topic. We have a great pleasure to have those who you know very well for our audience, James Kinnaman, our research associate at Florence School of Regulation, and has conducted basically lead all our researches in hydrogen in our school. And the idea of today is having like our session as you use it, we have it as an open discussion, as to discover and dive into the challenges of this drafting this regulation. So we will give the floor to Nuno, who will present, and afterwards we will have our discussion. And of course, for the audience who wants to raise questions, you can raise questions during the presentation, and we will collect it to address to dedicate the last 50 minutes of the session for your questions. And without more further ado, I would pass the words to Nuno. Thank you so much, Nuno, for your time and to present the task force of IEN to FSR audience.
Thank you, Lucila, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very hopeful that we can have a nice discussion about what is a topic that is at the forefront of any aspect of the hydrogen world, so to speak. I will share my presentation, and then we can take it from there. Please let me know if it's working okay. I think it is it? No, not yet. Just bear with me for a second. Share. It's working, right?
Okay, now he goes, yes.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. So basically, I want to talk to you not simply about the work of the AIN, but more broadly to combine that with the experience I've had as a practitioner, as well as someone teaching hydrogen in the Catholic University here in Lisbon. And the contents of the presentation is something that I've picked up in all these three aspects. Going on to the contents of the presentation, essentially I'll have 5 topics. The first one will be on the AIN's Hydrogen Task Force. Then I'll talk a little bit about hydrogen-related agreements. Then we'll go into the issue of the HPAs, of H2 SPAs, and by H2 I include derivatives. And then what were some of the drafting challenges, and there are still drafting challenges when you go to draft a contract for sale and purchase of hydrogen. And then I'll have a few final remarks to open up the debate. So AIN is an association of individuals. There are corporate sponsors, but only individuals can be members. It's the Association of International Energy Negotiators, formerly Association of International Petroleum Negotiators. Simply put, as many other organizations and companies in this world, the focus on oil and gas shifted towards energy more broadly, and so it happened with AIN. The main point here within the work of AIN is the track record in developing model agreements to be used in the oil and gas industry. And those model agreements are now used worldwide across 5 continents whenever it comes to the oil and gas industry. So when the scope of the organization was expanded, one of the issues that came up, okay, now we have different areas to work with. We have to start expanding also our work, our expertise, and see what we can do. And so 3 task forces were created. One for CCS or CCUS, however you want to talk about it, ESG, and another one for hydrogen. And I was invited to lead the hydrogen task force. The work started in the beginning of 2022 and ended for this first phase, and I'll explain why, towards the end of last year. So basically 2 full years of work. In essence, the outcome of the task force in those 2 years is the preparation of the groundwork for a hydrogen sale and purchase agreement, the groundwork for a hydrogen joint development and operating agreement, and then the groundwork for a term sheet for financing of hydrogen projects. In essence, what we have is that we had new drafting committees already being formed for the hydrogen joint development and operating agreement and for the model hydrogen sale and purchase agreement. What are these drafting committees? Anyone can be a part of them, and basically it's a group of people who volunteer themselves to draft clauses to be then incorporated into a model agreement, and that model agreement is shared with the associates of AIN. The term sheet on financing of hydrogen projects is a bit more complex. It's still undergoing some work with a focus group of people to fine-tune. It's a 100+ page instrument, and it's only a term sheet. It's not even a full-fledged contract. So basically what I'm going to talk about is the hydrogen SPA or H2 SPA or HPA. I can use any of those denominations. When we talk about hydrogen-related contracts, this is a panorama that I've prepared and I've used both in Portugal and abroad to talk about what are the issues here. In terms of contracts, and if we think about the hydrogen value chain in 3 separate parts, what we can talk production or upstream, conversion or midstream, and applications or downstream, the type of contracts that exist in each of these 3 areas are kind of jotted down at the bottom of this slide for each of the three areas. As you can see, the hydrogen purchase agreement does not exist in the first phase. There we are talking about other types of contracts. It comes into play in the second and the third phases. What do I mean? We can have sale of hydrogen between a producer and some entity that is going to convert the hydrogen in some other product. It can be integrated in the same project. And ultimately, what I can sell is to the applications. And it's not the same if I am going to sell a product, and by product, I mean hydrogen and derivatives, a product to, for example, a refinery or to a fertilizer company. They will
Okay, I don't know if we lose Nuno. Can you just confirm if the internet
I think we've lost Nuno.
okay, so I
Let me
will
just
I
let me just check with Clara.
because he might be the case that he might be speaking. One second. Okay, so we try to reconnect it, that Nuno would reconnect it, which is a bit, we have never happened with us. He's online, so I hope he's seen his email, so I will ask him to reconnect it. 1 second. So he said that his laptop did collapse while he was speaking. I apologize, but he was trying to reconnect it in 1 minute. So I will ask the audience just a few questions so we will get it back. Usually when you have one more speaker, it's easy because sometimes you ask the person to take over, and the second speaker will take over. In this case, like, well, Nuno is the keynote speaker or main speaker. So it's a bit we get also blocked from our side, not only his computer, but we also get blocked in our agenda. So a little patience, he will be back, and we can start the presentation.
In the meantime, you can feel free to send your questions in the Q&A chat, and Nuno will be able to address them towards the end of the presentation, as well as the other co-hosts.
Mm. Okay, no. So nice to have you back. It happens. You still muted? I think you were muted.
To unmute. Yeah, getting. It's literally Murphy's Law. I run dozens of meetings a week. This never happens. It had to happen in a meeting like this, of course. Many apologies for that. I'm going to try to share. The computer literally blocked. I had to relaunch it. So apologies for that. I'll try and share the presentation once more. And
Okay.
okay. Okay, here we are. Now slides moving forward. This is where we were. I kind of need to know up to which point did you hear me? I was already explaining this downstream part. Have you got that?
Yes, we do. We are following.
Okay, so where I was at when the computer blocked, and I apologize again for that, I was talking about the HPA having to adapt to the kind of off-taker from any of these applications here. And it may be one type of product if it is delivered to one type of off-taker. I gave the examples of refineries and fertilizers, as well as mobility if you use it in fuel cells. They are different kind of products to be delivered, and that has an impact on the contract. So basically, when we look at an HPA or an H2 SPA, or including derivatives, AIN has three principles that are critical to develop model contracts. First of all, it has to be a contract that is industry accepted. And by industry accepted, we try to reflect the number of issues. For example, it has to be a contract that if it goes to a bank for project financing, the bank will accept it. It makes the project bankable. It has to look at comparable industries and other model forms. Optionalities. It can reflect different offtake principles, but they have to be clear and typically technology neutral. That's what we try to do when we look at an SPA. In AIN, we focused on a green hydrogen / derivative type of HPA. So, for example, we never looked into the issues concerning blue hydrogen, if you will, the term, or low carbon hydrogen, however you want to refer to it. Then it's supposed to be a model that reflects a balance between all participants, stakeholders. So it's not supposed to privilege the producer or the user or the financier. It's supposed to provide a balance, a basis for negotiation that is balanced. And it's supposed to be country neutral. And by country neutral, we are acknowledging, for example, that in terms of certification, in terms of LCA, there is no standard accepted globally, and much will depend on aspects that are specific to the situation we are dealing with, and of course, to the type of project involved. Some of the drafting challenges, and this is basically, take these as if it were a term sheet. Let's talk about the form of agreement. Typically, the HPA will be a full-fledged agreement, not just a head of terms or anything like that. It's a full-fledged contract, a sale and purchase contract. The acquisition of a specific product. That product has to be tailor-made to buyer and seller, depends on the project on the producer's side, depends on the seller or user on the demand side. And here we have different derivatives that can be used in addition to hydrogen. In terms of carbon intensity, there are specifications that have to be met. As I mentioned, we focused on green hydrogen, and the contracts I've been worked with in my practice, they are about green hydrogen or green hydrogen derivatives. There are specifications and carbon methodologies that have to be defined, but that's on a case-by-case basis. On the delivery terms, it depends very much on the type of project, on the type of transaction that is involved. For example, typically, if we talk large-scale projects for export to another country, we are probably talking about ammonia as the product, and we're probably talking about a delivery that is under DAP or DES Incoterms terms, but it can include FOB or other terms that are different in terms of Incoterms. Midstream activities may be issues that are difficult for certain project finance developers. For example, if the project integrates conversion from hydrogen to another product, and if that is part of the project, that may lead to difficulties, and the allocation of responsibilities midstream need to be accounted for. The same goes for the delivery point. It can be literally outside of the production. It can be at the user's standpoint. It can be in the middle of the ocean. Title and risk will pass from buyer to seller depending on the structure that is defined. In essence, there are three issues involved: project structure, the type of off-taking, and the financing. The offtake, there are several models. I'll give you an example, for example, that concerns natural gas. You can find a take or pay obligation in a gas sales agreement, but in that case, you have volumes that are specified for that take or pay obligation. Here, there are variables. We can talk about these offtake models. It can be a hybrid model. It can be only a push model. And by push, literally is the seller pushes the volumes that it can produce to the seller, and the seller takes it on, irrespective of how much it's being transferred. The offtake structure, by structure, we look into, for example, is it one buyer? Is it two buyers? Can they be changed throughout the project? Is it a spot market that we are looking for? All of these changes and has to do with the stage of development of the hydrogen market at a specific point in time. HPAs will vary with that. This is important, for example, for those more connected to projects, to the bankability of the project. Product specifications, this is an interesting point to the extent that we don't have any specific standard applicable worldwide, but we certainly include in the contract, for example, chemical specifications, production specifications, greenhouse gas specifications in terms of emissions. There is an ISO standard that has been developed for these purposes and that can be resorted to, and it may or may not include a specific certification that is already available out there. Typically, the contract will say exactly what kind of product is to be delivered, what is the production scheme and how it is made, and also the emissions that are expected from that. Then you can have auditing terms, you can have sampling terms, you can have a number of mechanisms that allow you to confirm that. Shortfalls and failure to take, they are related to the offtake model. They can be tricky to deal with to the extent that the push model is not typical in the market for comparable industries. Transportation and delivery, it's going to depend on the product. It's going to depend on the location. For example, a project that is co-located production versus use, the transportation equation is out of the table. It's not a concern. If you have a large-scale project for exportation, then transportation becomes an issue. Liability also has some issues that have to be dealt with. The simplest one to evidence is technology. There are no large-scale green hydrogen projects operating these days. For example, scaling electrolyzers could or could not be an issue, and then liability needs to be dealt with accordingly, because there may be failures by stacking electrolyzers to a level that was not expected. Off-spec products, that's related to the issue that I mentioned above of certification, and then certain boilerplate clauses may have to be tailor-made for the specific aspects of the project, the off-taking, and the type of product that is in question. Just to finalize then, what would be the issues that one would have to look into in this context? And by the way, if you want to know, there is one project in the world that has reached the FID phase, the final investment decision, and that's the NEOM project. That's the only one we nowadays know how it more or less works. 100% of the off-taking was guaranteed by one single off-taker. The end use is not yet defined. So when dealing with an HPA, we have to talk about project structuring, the size of the project, the level of integration between production and conversion, for example, whether the power supply is integrated in the project or is not integrated in the project, whether we need PPAs or do not need PPAs, all of that is a variable. Regulatory and public incentives environment, this varies as well. If we are in the US and we are in Europe, we are in entirely different regulatory backgrounds and incentives backgrounds that need to be accounted for. The parties may or may not wish to deal with them in a contract. Then the definition of the product, that's certainly an issue. Transportation, storing, and storage and receiving terminals are also an issue. And then how you deal with the financing and incentives in a project is relevant. What would I consider, and this is how I hand, to be the risks when dealing with an HPA? Literally, there are risks relating to two main issues. Market creation, which is market does not exist. We are creating a market, and then moving goalposts. By moving goalposts, I mean, for example, changes that were not expected. Most people will think immediately regulatory, but does not necessarily have to be regulatory. For example, for those who are not aware, there is something called white hydrogen or geologic hydrogen. If some of the reports that are surfacing materialize in reality, that will be an entirely overhauling of the whole of the hydrogen space as we know it, because the volumes that seem to be available, if they are able to be captured and used, that will change the hydrogen market definitively. Then there are other issues that, for example, are moving goalposts. Innovation. Nowadays, for example, methane pyrolysis is let's call it, it's an innovatory technology, not yet proven at scale. If it were proven at scale, that could change a lot of things. And then there are market creation issues like accidents and incidents. If there would be, for example, a big explosion involving hydrogen, I think most politicians would shy away from working with hydrogen for a very long period of time. Or incidents, for example, corruption with the incentive models and things like that. And the same goes, for example, for greenwashing. If someone would prove that certain certification schemes or certain audits were simply greenwashing of, let's say, the renewable nature of the hydrogen, that could simply destroy the hydrogen market. So basically, an HPA, it's a piece of a puzzle. in the hydrogen space that is critical to create the market. Why? Because it simply put, it relates buyers and sellers. If we need an example of how this is important, for example, in the context of the European Union, we only need to see the pilot scheme that the European Union is launching for exactly creating a platform that relates buyers and sellers. And I'll stop it here, Lucila. Again, apologies for the interruption.
Fantastic. No, thank you so much for such a clear and objective presentation. I think this is exactly what I expect with FSL Talk. It's a presentation that goes beyond EU, actually has attracted global audience, and this is exactly an example of the H2 SPA. But without further ado, I will pass the word to James. James, perhaps what we can do in terms of time, of course, me and Carol, to ensure that we take advantage as best of the time, we will leave it for the audience, questions and answers, and we'll refrain ourselves for hosting and moderated. So James, perhaps what you can do is like address all your questions instead of having like a questions and a conversation as far to be more effective the time, and then we can address all your questions and Nuno can answer one by one. I think let's try to leave the last 10 minutes at least for
Okay, so to ask all my questions in one go and then Nuno hold them in his head, or to go one by one? I don't.
Yeah, I think if you address all the questions
Okay.
and then Nuno can answer them all. I think it's the most efficient way of
Okay, fine, no problem at all. So perhaps it's worthwhile to say, first of all, off the bat, that it's really interesting to see such a presentation. And given that we talk at the FSR and in this kind of public affairs space so often about regulation and incentives and targets, political and otherwise, for the sector, it's really interesting and refreshing to get this kind of insight into what's going on with the actual contractual agreements. And I'm encouraged at least by the fact that there's a market for these kind of agreements. That in itself is a positive sign. And I congratulate Nuno and his colleagues for his work on that, because it's a huge facilitator that doesn't get a lot of attention, right, in public discourse, but is of course absolutely essential for enabling the build out of the sector. So yeah, many congratulations for that, and thanks very much for sharing today. It was a super interesting presentation. My first question is perhaps a little bit unfair, because I didn't tell Nuno that I was going to ask him about this, but still, I hopefully can shed some light. It just sort of popped into mind whilst he was presenting the situation as it stands. So, whilst I was listening to you, you're talking about, standardized contracts, or sort of repeatable off-the-shelf contracts that could be used by different parties under different circumstances, which implicitly makes sense, and of course has had lots of success in the oil and gas sector. But due to the issues that you latterly presented, by virtue of the fact that it's a nascent sector, but moreover, the fact that each project has such unique characteristics, like the transport mode, the offtake type, whether it's long distance or it's co-located, et cetera, all these variables, you can probably see where I'm going with the question, which is how easy is it in such a scenario to use standardization, as a model? I mean, the repeatability, it seems to be at odds fundamentally in that sense, at least in this moment. So I wondered if you could shed a little bit of light on that, your experience so far, if you don't mind. I guess consistent with that question is these sort of industries and models that you referenced in the early part of the presentation that you try and take learnings from. Given the history of your organization, I mean, it's obvious oil and gas. Are there any others in, I don't know, clean commodities or things with other complex value chains that have sort of more nuance and diversity in, that are outside of what we might perhaps immediately assume are comparable models? That would be really interesting to hear. I'd just be curious, by nature of the different agreements, do you foresee them to be more sort of national and local, particularly within certain regulatory borders, or do you envisage these kind of agreements to be more often utilized across regulatory environments, and therefore how big a component is facilitating the sort of regulatory interoperability? Because you mentioned, for example, delivering a form of certification that's appropriate for the delivering region, right? The destination for the product. So how well are you able to overcome these kind of interoperability issues between regulation? Similarly, with standards and certification, there's now sort of renewable standards for RFMBOs and so clean hydrogen and derivatives essentially. But in most cases, these definitions are not necessarily finalized. So do you take just the most ambitious best case and use that as your baseline, or how are you sort of planning to approach this issue, and do you have a certain LCA methodology? I think you mentioned the ISO standard at some point. I know that there was recently an ISO standard that was announced, for example. Also on the commodity types, I think you sort of already mentioned that ammonia is already the most popular, and I understand that this is because there are lots of reasons why, but not least because ammonia is already traded, right? It's an example where you have a sort of like for like, direct decarbonization, whereas although hydrogen is consumed now, fossil hydrogen is consumed now, it's not traded because it's produced in almost all circumstances immediately adjacent to where it's consumed, right? Whereas the difference with ammonia is it is shipped. So intuitively, it makes sense that ammonia be, an easy first starting point for these kind of agreements. But do you see that as a trend that will likely continue for the foreseeable future? Or are you looking, more seriously at SAF and, sustainable aviation fuels or even renewable hydrogen itself? I don't know, maybe I'm asking now too many questions. You can stop me if you think we're running out of space. I also wondered, there are some of these kind of public auction mechanisms that also have an international component. So H2 Global, for example, allows for sort of project matching, and that includes extra EU projects, so imports from outside the EU, even though it's a German-funded pot. Is there a relationship between the kind of agreements that you propose for the clients, or are they completely separate? Are they purely commercial to commercial, sort of private partner agreements? Probably that's enough for now. I have another question about white hydrogen, but maybe only if there's time. So yeah, thanks again.
Thank you so much, James. No, I would.
Thanks a lot, James. Can I just ask you to clarify your last question? Why hydrogen? What exactly was the question?
On white hydrogen, yeah, I mean, I agree. It's potentially very disruptive. I know the Australians even call it gold hydrogen, so that tells you probably all you need to know about about its disruptive potential and the
I'll talk about that. Yeah, I'll talk about that.
But my question specifically is, intuitively, I would imagine that, given that for those in the audience who are not familiar with what white hydrogen is essentially naturally occurring geologically produced hydrogen that forms underground and then can be sort of extracted in a similar way to natural gas. But, what we understand from it in its early stages is that it's sort of far less disruptive, and it's not what you would call of fossil origin necessarily anyway. It's sort of happening by I'm definitely doing a poor explanation of this, and a chemical engineer would correct me, but it's sort of an organic chemical reaction that's happening underground, and it's happening consistently. And as such, it's sort of naturally bubbling towards the surface and just needs tapping off, essentially, in the best cases. And although there's huge range in the potential price of utilizing this kind of hydrogen, there are potentially large quantities, millions of tons available in the region of about €1 a ton. And of course, without all of the technological complexity and such. So, Nuno, I absolutely agree with you that this could be hugely disruptive. But my assumption would be that this is much closer to the model you're used to, right? With oil and gas contracts, this would be presumably much easier than the kind of complexity. But maybe I'm wrong. So I'd be curious to hear what you say.
Yes and no, in my view. Well,
okay.
First of all, I will try to address all the points that you mentioned, and starting with the standardized contracts. Maybe there is a misconception about standardized contracts. Standardized contracts are not adherence contracts. In other words, they are not contracts that are drafted and then you accept or you reject. But there's very little you can do about that. It's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is a basis for negotiation, and a basis that is balanced. And in many cases within AIN, there are two things that we normally do with contracts, which is guiding notes, guidance notes, explanatory notes, whatever you want to call them, which go hand in hand with the contract and which tell you, for example, I'll give you an example that always arises in the oil and gas industry, liability issues. If you work in a context that is, let's call it the Anglo-American legal systems or family thereof, you have types of liability that, simply put, do not exist at all in continental law. We have an entirely different structure for liability. When we draft a model contract within the petroleum industry, that variable is there. You should pay attention whether you're inserting this contract in a context that is English law, Texas law, or something like that, or otherwise, if you're going to a continental law system. So basically, the model contract is more a basis for negotiation than a contract that is set in stone for acceptance or rejection. What this means is, even if we cannot repeat the draft clauses, we can have alternative draft clauses, which is one thing. We can have the definition of the product as one of the issues that you need to change. If you have one product, then you have to define that product. You don't define the other. But it is there. The structure with which you work, if you want to put it that way, the structure with which you work, it's the same. It remains the same. And you know that the issues are there. They may be varied. Price, of course, and pricing mechanisms, everyone understands that they can't be set in stone. That's a negotiation. It's the typical clause that you negotiate. How you define the price in any contract, how you define the price, and whether there is a price adjustment mechanism, that's a contractual issue. It's the same here. It's not set in stone. It allows you to look into it. So they are, let's say, a tool rather than an end in themselves. They are intended to be a tool to work with when you negotiate the sale and purchase of hydrogen and derivatives. Now, industries that can be used as models, yes, oil and gas is the obvious one. I'll give you an example from which hydrogen can learn and can be used as an example. LNG. LNG did not exist 30 years ago, basically. There were some examples, but they were rare. Nowadays, it's everywhere. LNG was a market that was created. It has the similarities with hydrogen, that there was a ramp up of the market at some point, but still there were contracts. And so there are some examples, and when comparing hydrogen with LNG, there are some examples that can be used. The other example, it's the very market of hydrogen. You just said ammonia is sold in the world. Well, it's gray ammonia, but it's sold. So we can look into those clauses and look at them. The same goes for hydrogen. So that's another one. The other one, less close, I would say, are, for example, standardized contracts in greener industries, like you said, for example, a PPA. One could look into a PPA especially with the boilerplate clauses, to look into them and see how they would be addressed. But I would say, literally, oil and gas at the top, and the very hydrogen market would be the second. So HPAs, national, local, international, I would say all of the above. National, local, international. It will depend on the project. Let me put it this way. Think about clusters, hubs of heavy industries, cement, petchem, all of them, for example, located within a certain area, because countries sometimes define certain areas there as industrial areas, and they put all the industries there side by side. Let's, for example, imagine that someone comes and says, okay, I'm going to green up all the hydrogen those industries use, and I'm going to set up production of green hydrogen near them. So that's an entirely different proposition of, for example, comparing, to use one example that you mentioned in a different context, but I'll go there, to importing, for example, ammonia from places like Saudi Arabia, Northern Africa, or even Namibia. Those would be structures for the whole of the project that would be entirely different. So I would say that in terms of regulatory interoperability, much will depend on the off-taker. If you have an off-taker in Europe, and let's use an example we all are probably more familiar with, one of the requirements for the 10 million tons of imported hydrogen that is in the target of Repower EU is that, well, they should comply with the delegated acts. Well, guess what? In countries like, just to mention the three I already mentioned, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Namibia, there is no bidding zones. So we'll have to adapt that, but there will have to be something that shows this is a bidding zone because of this and this reason, and this bidding zone works on this structure, or simply put, there is direct connection. And if there is a direct connection between power production and hydrogen production, then we have the issue dealt with. So I think all of the above will exist depending on who the off-taker is and where is production located. They may be local, as the first example I gave. They may be international. They may be intra-EU type of arrangements where production is, for example, in the Iberian Peninsula and consumption is, for example, in Central Europe, not the Nordics because they can have their own green hydrogen. Okay, certification, standards, FUMBOs. Well, it's true, there is no certification worldwide. As I said, the off-taker will probably prevail in terms of the type of compliance that you have to have in mind. I would say that the easier way will be to incorporate in the contract the requirements that are compliant with the off-taker's requirements, because that will make things easier. If producer can deliver something compliant for the off-taker, if we look at the European Union example, it'll be satisfied, we are done. I think that there will be trickier issues. I think that definition of the product to be delivered will be easier. I think that LCA for the project might be a trickier issue, but that's where, for example, ISO standards may come into play and assist in defining that. And it can be, for example, to give you a very clear example, there is an ISO standard for hydrogen fuel cell grade. It's defined. So you can simply refer to the ISO standard and say it's grade B, and you're going to sell that. So that would be an incorporation of an existing, let's say, not certification, but an existing standard, and whether or not you can be certified as producing at that standard, that's a different issue that probably requires auditing and sampling and things like that that can be incorporated in the contract. Okay, now commodities. I would kind of shy away from mentioning commodity in the context of hydrogen simply because there is no market except for ammonia. It's the only international market there is. So speaking of commodity in where we don't have a market structure where supply and demand operate in a manner that is known, I would shy away from that. But if by commodity you mean product, I'm okay with that. That's perfectly fine. I would say hydrogen for short distances or co-location. I would say ammonia for long distance. I don't think it's a coincidence that NEOM is going to export green ammonia from Saudi Arabia to Europe. I think it's setting the standard, and I think that's going to happen in other cases. I will not be breaching any confidentiality because it was in the newspapers. There's a project I'm working with, I'm advising on here in Portugal, and it's the same structure, exporting green ammonia out of Portugal to another country. So, but there will be the possibility of SAF. E-methanol will be also a key product. Why? E-methanol, because of shipping. Because of decarbonization of shipping, e-methanol might become a key product. SAF may be a bit more far away in the timeline, whereas e-methanol is closer. Both of them will require a solution for the CO2 value chain, CO2 infrastructure, CO2 commoditization, so to speak, because without CO2, none of these exist. So Europe did not pay attention enough in the beginning to the CO2 value chains. It's now, for example, you look at Germany, and they are now having a law for the carbon capture part, because you may capture and use, or you may just capture, or you may capture for use in different volumes. So I think that all of them will be available. As I illustrated, off-takers have different needs. If an off-taker is going to use hydrogen, he or she knows that it will lose efficiency if, for example, they take a different product and then they have to convert it back. For example, cracking ammonia back to hydrogen, that's an efficiency loss that might not result in a good contract, so to speak. That's just an example. So H2 Global, EHB, I think they are different in nature. EHB, it's an incentive for producers, specifically on the supply side. It doesn't refer to pricing or anything else, and it's not incorporated because the HPA will set a price. Whether or not the producer gets an incentive from EHB, that's an entirely different matter that the parties may or may not consider in the contract. For example, what the supplier is going to do, the producer is saying, I will deliver to you product X at the price Y. And that doesn't matter whether I, producer, get an incentive or do not get an incentive, which is what EHB does. I don't need to take that into account in the contract. But as I said, freedom of contract, this is a contract between private parties. They can do whatever they want within certain bounds. And if they want to consider incentive mechanisms, they can do that. For example, in price adjustment mechanisms, if they wish to do that. And it can cut both ways, because you can have, right now EHB is supporting supply, but if you have support to demand, you can also have an impact on price if the demand side gets some sort of incentive. So it's basically a clean slate where you can do a lot of different things. H2 Global, my understanding is entirely different. I think there is a standardized contract, actually, that if you are going to supply within H2 Global, you are going to accept that HPA that they devised. And there's very little you can do about that. In essence, I would say H2 Global has an HPA incorporated in the mechanism, and you just bid the price. You say, my price for supplying SAF or for supplying ammonia is this. And I accept the contract, and the contract then is applied to that price. Finally, why white hydrogen, gold hydrogen, geologic hydrogen, however you want to refer to, it's naturally existing hydrogen. Just for those who are less familiar with it, the issue is that typically hydrogen does not exist freely in nature. It's usually a compound that includes hydrogen. That's why we have to produce it, because we have to extract from molecules, whether from water, H H2O, or from methane, CH4. And there's hydrogen in a molecule that we are going to take out, so to speak. The difference with this geologic hydrogen is, as you quite rightly explained, it can be separated while in nature. It exists separate from other compounds, or virtually separate from other compounds. The question is, can we extract it? Because if the volumes that are available are anywhere near what people have said, this would completely shaken any market of hydrogen. What's the catch? The catch, one, there is no technology. Two, the risks are extremely high because hydrogen, as you know, it's a very explosive thing. If you don't deal with it properly, you are bound to have problems. So until one can devise a technology to extract white hydrogen, it's not going to happen. But if there is a technological breakthrough, then there is an issue. I'll give you a different example that doesn't involve hydrogen, but involves methane. Methane hydrates. We are all fully aware that in the sea you have methane hydrate, around molecules of water you have methane, but we've never learned how to capture that. It has been the subject of research, but you can't use it. It's there, but you can't use it. I think it's more or less what happens with white hydrogen. It's a variable that can change the stakes. I hope I covered everything.
Extremely comprehensive, very impressive in the time. I have loads of notes, so thank you very much, Nuno. I could comment more, but we have little time, so I'll leave it over to our Q&A. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Nuno. It was perfect. I see you taking water, like how fast you answer all the questions and all the points, and we were very extremely clear. And I will jump immediately in the Q&A because we have like many questions coming. We'll give you attention, and perhaps if you could explain, and especially give attention to Joanna points when she asked, is there a typical expected type of offtake agreement for renewable hydrogen? Here she mentioned about take or pay. Another participants also mentioned take or pay contracts, alternatives, as it would be like the most common used in the oil and gas, especially. There was another question in terms of how can be hedged the regulatory risk is stemming from the information of H2 markets in the key markets. And perhaps the third one, if it would be possible, if you can already identify some pricing models for the H2 SPA, or if you can expect some of modern pricing, I would say winning in the different models that we can use it in these contracts. I think you were muted, you know?
Thank you, Lucila. Going to Joanna's question first, then, I would say any model is possible. It can be take or pay. It can be push model. It can be hybrid, take or pay and push. It can be a bespoke principle that the parties agree to, different than any of this. I have seen typically a hybrid model, take or pay plus push. What do I mean? There is an obligation because the producer knows there is a minimum they are expecting to produce. So there is a take or pay obligation for that minimum. Then there is a push model for any excess of product produced. The producer will sell it. Buyer is obliged to take it, and then the pricing might vary or might not vary. It is different. So I'm seeing different types, and I don't think that we have seen the end of it. I think that these models were basically imported from the experience in LNG, and does the influence. I think the push model was derived by the simplest of reasons. Fluctuation in production is very high when it comes to green hydrogen, and that led to this. But I think we can have any model. I would say that the hybrid will probably gain some traction to the extent that it makes an obligation on the buyer, and it still gives flexibility to the buyer to produce more if it can find gains of efficiency. So that's the one. So the second one, Lucila, I'm asking for your help, was the last one in the chat. Was that it?
Yes, exactly.
So thank you for the. Can you please develop how can hedge regulatory risk stemming for in key markets? What kind of clauses were used in the first years of the LNG market? Well, the LNG market was a different market. Why? Because everyone knows what is LNG, and it's only one product, and it is what it is. It has some specs, it's true, but it's methane liquefied. That's it. So the variables in regulatory terms were not as big. The main issue was, could they be specs compliant? Could the LNG in question be specs compliant? That was one issue. And then transportation to the local market was assured. The issue here is not the same with hydrogen, because when we are talking about regulatory risk when it comes to hydrogen, is I may be in a country where producing hydrogen has a regulatory background, but my off-taker is, let's use concrete examples. I may be in the US, where the IRA provides a certain background for producing green hydrogen, and then I export to the European Union, where the off-taker is subject to a different regulatory background. I would say the regulatory background of the off-taker would prevail. The good news in this case, which probably is going to be setting a pattern, or possibly going to set a pattern, is that even though the US started very loosely, oh, we don't want to be too stringent, then when it came to the nitty-gritty of things, they wrote a regulation that is very similar to the one we have in Europe, with additionality, with the issues of the measurement of the emissions through life cycle and all of that. So I don't think the regulatory risk is a major issue. In any event, I would say that the agreement will be on what kind of product, what kind of production mechanism, and how you assess the emissions of the producing segment of the relationship. There were no similar clauses in the LNG market, because in the LNG market, what existed were specs of specs, which you can also have here, which are different from the certification scheme for the hydrogen. Then main pricing models, there are good news and bad news. Good news is there is no pricing model in place, so you can do whatever you want to define the price, as long as you have a buyer that sells at a certain price and a seller that agrees to sell at that price. The bad news is, because you don't have a pricing model, you face yourself sometimes with a very big difference between buyer and seller and their expectations. What's the problem with green hydrogen? And here I'm going to tell you to look in the internet for something that James wrote. There is a nice figure there that explains the concept of premium, and the issue is that premium. If someone is willing on the off-taking side to pay a premium, the amount of that premium will determine whether seller and buyer can reach an agreement on the price. There is no pricing model right now. And the results of the European Hydrogen Bank shows that, for example, in the sector of use, there was a difference between industry, which was around 5 to 6, 7 to 8, 9, and no, the other way around. Industry, we didn't accept to pay more than €5 kilogram of hydrogen for industry purposes, whereas in mobility they were willing to pay a higher premium, and they would go to 7, 8, and probably close to 9. So even the sector changes the pricing model that you use. The sector of use, that is to say, the buyer. And I would invite you all to look into this concept of premium, because it explains a lot about the pricing mechanisms of HPAs.
Fantastic, Nuno. Thank you so much. I think we managed to actually it was so intense and with so much volume that definitely the disconnection basically had no effect in the quality of the event. No doubts about it. Thank you so much for the attendees.
Thank you for saying that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nuno. Thank you so much, James and Carol. It was a great pleasure. I think this is the benchmark model that what events that we expect at FSR in terms of content and quality. Of course, thanks for the audience. As we all know, the recording of the event is going to be available in the FSR website, and you are always welcome. The FSR is open to you and your work to present it high quality research.
Thank you so much for the kind words, Lucilla. It was my pleasure, and thank you, James, for making it interesting.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for the presentation and for the invite. It was really interesting. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.